Actually, this is our last talk of the Peacemaking in Africa series, the last of the 8. And as usual, I want to thank all the people who helped contribute to this. The biggest financial support, again, is the New Mexico Humanities Council. You can check out their website. They do a lot of events, as I've mentioned before, of all different types. I also wanted to thank Loyola Chastain and Dr. Ian Stewart, because they did the majority of the work in getting everyone here, in some cases from quite far away. Also wanted to thank some departments for their support: Africana Studies, Anthropology, Foreign Languages and Literatures, the Honors College, English, and in this particular case, anthropology. This is one of the ones that anthropology was interested in. And then also in general for the whole lecture series, history has been helping out as well. And then usually I would introduce an introducer, but we don't have a representative from the World Affairs delegation. So I will still mention them though, because they have been helping us throughout this process. That's the student group. Again, if you guys are interested in participating in that, you can contact them. They have their email address, wadunm, or unmwad@unm.edu. So that's something you might want to get involved with. So I'm going to introduce our speaker, who is Dr. Christian Williams, who got his PhD at the University of Michigan, and then promptly went international, went overseas. He's been doing a lot of things in Africa. One thing he did was he taught at a missionary school in Namibia, rural Namibia. He said if anyone knows the name of where he worked, he'll give you 1 million
Namibian dollars.
Namibian dollars.
No dollars.
But then he got a postdoc position at West Cape Coast University, that is in South Africa. And then for the last 5 years, he's been at the University of the Free State, which is also in South Africa. And so he's a senior lecturer of anthropology there right now. And that's a good example. Aside from introducing him, I'm also going to make the point. It is possible to get a degree in the United States and get jobs overseas. Dr. Williams is proof of that. So we will now listen to what he's learned and what he teaches at these universities.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for being here, and especially for the University of New Mexico's International Studies Institute. I'm very grateful for the invitation, and I especially want to point out Ian Stewart and Steve Bishop, as well as Loyola Chastain, for all the work they've done to get me here. I'm very appreciative of it. And I thank you also to the undergraduates who just participated in the class with me. I really enjoyed that. It was a good conversation. I hope that gives some good background for what I'm going to share this evening. So this evening, I'm going to share a story. It is a story of a couple and how their lives are entwined with the history of a nation, Namibia, and a region, Southern Africa. As you'll hear, in some respects, it is a story of failed peacemaking in Africa, a story of how democracy was undermined in the course of struggling against racism and colonialism in Southern Africa. But I also believe it's an instructive story for thinking about what it might mean to make peace in Southern Africa and beyond in the future. Finally, I should add that it's a very personal story. It's personal because it's part of my ongoing work in Namibia, aimed at promoting dialogue around conflicts that occurred there in exile and its aftermath. Work that I've been doing there really since I started. I was started as a volunteer teacher in Namibia in 2000, and by 2002, I was working on doing a master's degree on this theme, so I've been working on this now for 17 years or so. But beyond that, it's personal because I have a relationship with the couple at the center of the story, with whom I lived in 2007 and 2008, off and on, and who I've visited frequently since then. And if you have any questions related to this aspect of this story I'm going to tell, I'm glad to entertain them later, even though I don't speak so much about my personal relationship with the people in question in the presentation itself. So, let me begin and tell the story. In January 1974, Reverend Salatiel Ailonga began his work as the first chaplain to Namibians in exile. Although initially the chaplaincy only served a few hundred Namibians, most of whom were affiliated with the Namibian Liberation Movement SWAPO and living in Zambia, within a few months, thousands more had joined them there. In turn, the chaplaincy found itself at the center of a humanitarian crisis, which Salatiel Ailonga, as a long-standing SWAPO member with global church networks, was uniquely placed to address by soliciting humanitarian aid abroad and distributing it in SWAPO's Zambian camps. At the same time, the chaplaincy became embroiled in a schism within SWAPO, which by the middle of 1976 had resulted in the imprisonment and/or deportation of more than 1,000 people, roughly 1/4 of SWAPO's exile population. Among those deported were Salatiel Ailonga and Anita Ailonga, Salatiel's Finnish missionary wife. This lecture presents a history of the chaplaincy in 3 parts. I begin by offering a background to how Southern African liberation movements and frontline state governments used the term refugee during the region's liberation struggles, highlighting an African refugee discourse and placing it within a global context. From there, it proceeds to discuss the manner in which the Ailongas articulated what it meant to be a Namibian refugee, suggesting the significance of their intervention for opening aid channels to SWAPO. Finally, the lecture considers how aid became politicized in SWAPO's Zambian camps, resulting not only in the Ailongas' June 1976 deportation, but also in changes in SWAPO thereafter. By tracing this history, the lecture illuminates a pivotal moment in Namibians' responses to their collective experiences of apartheid and displacement. As I explain, across its 3 decades of resistance to apartheid South African colonial rule in Namibia, SWAPO and its interlocutors were involved in an ongoing process of defining who a Namibian refugee was and how this figure should be assisted. For 2.5 years, the chaplaincy was a key player in this evolving field, drawing church bodies, which had hitherto been reluctant to aid SWAPO, into its fold of supporters, and helping displaced Namibians to weather a humanitarian storm. Nevertheless, the chaplaincy received aid outside the direct control of SWAPO officials and distributed it freely to exiled Namibians, including those on different sides of a conflict emerging within SWAPO at that time. As a result, the chaplaincy became threatening to some officials who were using aid to control allegiances in the liberation movement's fractious internal politics. With the Ailonga's expulsion from Zambia, SWAPO effectively centralized its humanitarian aid, displacing the more decentralized ad hoc appeals which the Ailongas and others had made on behalf of exiled Namibians during an earlier era. In so doing, it inaugurated a period in which solidarity, quote unquote, with Namibian refugees became synonymous with supporting existing hierarchies and escalating violence within SWAPO, a shift mirrored in the region's other liberation movements, which are also, in many cases, ruling parties of the region's governments. Such perspectives on defining and aiding refugees are largely overlooked. For example, if one reads what Namibian historians have written about this episode I'm going to describe tonight, most texts will focus on a conflict generated when SWAPO old guard politicians were confronting with incoming exiles' demands to convene a party congress and create a new, more accountable form of party government. From this nation-focused perspective, which presents the competing representatives and ideologies of a liberation movement, there's little place for the Ailongas and their apparently apolitical piecework presenting a humanitarian crisis to global audiences and tending to the basic human needs of refugees. Similarly, literature on the Scandinavian Eastern Bloc countries, these were two of the major supporters to Southern African liberation movements, tends to focus on aid sent from national governments to liberation movements. In so doing, it reduces humanitarianism to international aid channels and their archival traces, taking little notice of groups like the Chaplaincy, whose response to displacement was shaped through a more diverse array of transnational networks and intranational politics. As for broader refugee scholarship, it remains largely ahistorical, focused on refugee experiences from the 1990s onwards, and effectively ignoring Africa during the 1960s and 1970s. At that time, as we've just talked about for those who were in the class that I was just teaching, the international refugee regime, which had emerged at the end of the Second World War to settle displaced Europeans, was yet in its infancy, and its application in the non-Western world was unclear. By drawing attention to the chaplaincy, the lecture offers new insight into such unexplored dimensions of Southern Africa's liberation struggles and suggests the value of similar work for thinking historically about what it means to be a refugee. So, image, please. Across the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, the term refugee was associated with a particular set of meanings in Southern Africa. During those years, Angola, Mozambique, Namibia, South Africa, and Zimbabwe were all embroiled in anti-colonial struggles against white minority regimes, as were the frontline states in which hundreds and thousands of people fled. These are the states that are neighboring those countries. Tanganyika, later Tanzania, framed the conversation on these displaced people for the region. Following its political independence in December 1961, President Julius Nyerere articulated the country's open-door policy, granting entire groups of displaced people refugee status on a prima facie or at-first-sight basis. In other words, not individual-based refugee policy, which dominates much refugee policy in the world now. Regardless of whether Southern Africans living in Tanzania were liberation movement officials, guerrilla soldiers, registered students, or inhabitants of a United Nations refugee camp, they were all routinely classified by the Tanzanian government as refugees. At the same time, from the perspective of Tanzanian government and liberation movement officials, these refugees were also all freedom fighters, people preparing to liberate their respective homelands from colonialism, by arms if necessary. By 1969, the Organization of African Unity had officially adopted an overlapping position, defining refugees in a manner that accommodated group refugee status and encompassed liberation movement-affiliated freedom fighters, principles which Zambia and some other frontline states adopted in their domestic refugee policies. Although the circumstances in which they lived in different countries over 3 decades varied, displaced Southern Africans were repeatedly presented as a special category of refugee, who were not only victims of oppressive governments, but also agents of their own liberation. Nevertheless, what it meant to be a refugee from one of Southern Africa's still colonized countries was never as settled as the dominant frontline state discourse implied. Increasingly, from the early 1960s onwards, African states determined refugee status in conversation with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, UNHCR. Although many displaced by Southern Africa's white minority regimes fit the Geneva Convention's definition for a refugee, the UNHCR was ambivalent about aiding displaced people associated with the region's anti-colonial struggles, because, in so doing, it risked undermining the Commission's political neutrality as enshrined in its founding statute, of interfering in a so-called domestic affair, since these areas were still under colonial rule. In turn, this international legal context shaped recurring global representations, wherein refugees appear as exemplary victims, defined by physical wounds, childlike innocence, and related markers. Under these circumstances, Southern Africa's exile liberation movements and their allies could hardly ignore popular global perceptions of the refugee, and at times they actively reinforced them in efforts to secure aid, such as this early image of the Namibian refugee produced by SWAPO. Nevertheless, exiles and their interlocutors also had the capacity to revise such perceptions by projecting understandings of refugee identity that extended beyond prevailing imagery. In short, as people presented the region's refugees to far-flung audiences, they could define anew what it meant to be a refugee. For those opposing apartheid rule in Namibia, 1974 marked a key moment in this process of refugee definition. By the beginning of that year, several thousand Namibians were living in, or several hundred Namibians were living in Zambia. Within a few months, several thousand had moved to Zambia, however. Most of these refugees that were in Zambia at the beginning of 1974 were based at SWAPO's headquarters in Lusaka and in the western province, which is near the Namibian border. International aid to SWAPO was small relative to other Southern African liberation movements recognized by the OAU and the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, it was steadily increasing, due in large part to SWAPO's success at soliciting aid from far-flung donors on behalf of a distinct refugee population. Despite official frontline state discourse, which presented all Namibians living in Zambia as refugees, SWAPO and its interlocutors repeatedly used the phrase Namibian refugees to refer to a more specific group of people which had been displaced from Namibia's Caprivi Strip in October 1968 and had been resettled in camps run by the UNHCR in Zambia. This child is apparently one of those refugees. This group became the focus of SWAPO's first appeals to establish its own refugee camp, to be administered by the liberation movement for refugees who apparently had absconded from the UNHCR camp. And it was to be the foundation of a new Namibian society. In 1973, SWAPO's vision became a reality when 120 Namibian refugees moved to the Old Farm, a plot located on the outskirts of Lusaka, where the liberation movement began providing housing, food, and basic education to its people with promises of aid from the Swedish government. From the middle of 1974, the stakes for SWAPO in securing refugee aid increased dramatically. The event which sparked the rapid change in SWAPO's circumstances was Portugal's Carnation Revolution, which resulted not only in the overthrow of Marcelo Caetano's regime in Lisbon, but also in preparations for independence in Portugal's colonies, including Mozambique and Angola. And as you have seen in the previous map, Angola is the immediately north of Namibia. From June 1974 to August 1975, between 4,000 and 6,000 people fled from Namibia through Angola to Zambia, a period still known to Namibians as the Exodus. Upon arriving in Zambia, most Exodus exiles joined SWAPO, a development which reflected many of these exiles' prior involvement with SWAPO in Namibia, and SWAPO's efforts to provide for the basic needs of the Namibian nation in exile. Nevertheless, SWAPO's capacity to secure and distribute aid for the rapidly growing numbers of Namibians entering Zambia soon became strained. Next image, please. At this key moment in Namibian history, Salatiel and Anita Ilonga found themselves uniquely placed to present exiled Namibians to global humanitarian organizations and to distribute aid in SWAPO camps. To understand the Ilonga's position to mediate between Namibians and the world at this time, it is important first to know something of their prior experiences and future ambitions. In Salatiel's case, he himself was a Namibian with legal refugee status, who, like hundreds of others, had traveled from his childhood home in the Avamboland region of northern Namibia to Tanzania during the early 1960s. Upon arriving in Dar es Salaam in March 1964, Salatiel reported to the SWAPO office, where he was known to many of the liberation movement's officials through his participation in the movement previously and other shared experiences in Namibia. As one of relatively few Namibians who had accessed secondary school education prior to leaving his home country, SWAPO permitted Salatiel to choose whether he would serve the movement through military training or academic studies. He chose the latter and was admitted first to the African American Institute at Coruscini, a school that was run by an American organization giving money for and scholarships for African refugees in Africa at that time. And after completing his high school education at the African American Institute, he attended the Lutheran Theological College at Makamira near Arusha, where he completed his tertiary degree in 1973. Importantly, Salatio's studies in Makamira were endorsed by the Evangelical Lutheran of Ombokabongo Church, known as ELOC, and supported financially by the Finnish Mission Society. These are the two. The ELOC was the largest church in Namibia, and the Finnish Mission Society was the mission society that was responsible for missionizing in that part of Namibia. In 1972, next image please, Salatio met Anita Smeds, a Finnish Mission Society missionary, and I'll just refer to it as the FMS from now on, Finnish Mission Society, and the other church is ELOC, okay? Anita Smeds, an FMS missionary who had worked in Tanzania since 1960 and who was long known to SWAPO leaders, whom she had assisted with rent payments when the Liberation Movement established an office in Dar es Salaam in 1961. Soon Salatio and Anita were engaged to be married, and Salatio was making plans with church and SWAPO leaders for an organization that he would lead with Anita's assistance. This organization was officially established in January 1974 as the Chaplaincy to Namibians in Exile. Next image, please. From this earliest period, as Salatio and Anita prepared for their future work, Salatio presented the Chaplaincy as an organization committed to providing for the spiritual and practical assistance to Namibian refugees. For spiritual assistance, Salatio volunteered to serve as a pastor. There was no pastor of any denomination working among the Namibians at that time. Pastoral care would involve conducting regular services, baptisms, Christian education, confirmation, Sunday school, women's groups, discussions and Bible study groups, and pastoral counseling. For practical assistance, Salatio volunteered that he and Anita would work to improve education and social services among SWAPO. And Anita, at this point, already had a master's degree in social work and had founded a social work program among the Tanzania missionaries. So she had a lot of experiences with this. To accomplish this work, the Ilongas would need to relocate to Zambia, where most of the exiled Namibians were living. There, they hoped to reside briefly in Lusaka, where housing was more readily available, and SWAPO church and other humanitarian offices were located before moving to the old farm, the camp, where the needs of the people were the greatest. It went without saying that Salatio and Anita's SWAPO membership was crucial to the work. Many of the Namibians in Zambia were SWAPO members, as I've already shared, and they could only receive aid via SWAPO, not UNHCR or the International Commission for the Red Cross, whose aid did not extend to refugees belonging to liberation movements, so-called political refugees. No less significant were the Ilonga social networks with church organizations, which they hoped collectively would provide for Salatio's salary, Anita was not a chaplaincy employee, and support their refugee work. It follows from this description that the chaplaincy's work would rely significantly on how it presented who a Namibian refugee was to its core church constituencies. Although this work was ongoing throughout the chaplaincy's existence, one document which Salatio authored for potential church donors lays out his and Anita's viewpoint most comprehensively. As Salatio narrates, when the first Namibians first left their country in search for ways and means of liberating it during the early 1960s, they became alienated from the churches to which most had previously belonged in Namibia. This alienation resulted not only from the inevitable weakening of the ties to the home church, but also from the church's reluctance to get involved in politics. Even as churches gradually became more involved in caring for the needs of displaced people from southern Africa's still colonized countries, they gave humanitarian aid to the not politically committed refugees only. The chaplaincy's task was, therefore, to bridge the gap between the churches and SWAPO with understanding and humility. Central to this bridging work was helping the world to understand that Namibian refugees were, in many cases, both freedom fighters and Christians, whose predicament resulted from their deep commitment to Christian teachings about the equality of all men and justice and freedom in societies wherein oppression and exploitation reign. Far from the godless communists and terrorists of South African Cold War propaganda, Namibian refugees were in fact a God-fearing community in which the church had a special relationship and responsibility. In defining Namibian refugees as Christian freedom fighters, which is effectively how they were defined, the chaplaincy placed itself within a global conversation about humanitarian aid and anti-colonial struggle, which had particular resonance in the Southern African region. Importantly, from the late 1960s onwards, the UN General Assembly articulated its support for direct humanitarian assistance to liberation movements, representing people still under Southern African colonial regimes. By 1970, the World Council of Churches, which I'll refer to henceforth as the WCC, had established its ecumenical program to combat racism, through which members began to channel humanitarian support directly to SWAPO and other movements, extending the WCC's decade-long engagement with racism in Southern Africa. Also, and crucially, by 1971, ELOC's bishop, Leonard Owala, had published his open letter to South African Prime Minister B.J. Vorster, wherein he criticized the apartheid regime's failure to protect human rights in Namibia and identified his church openly with the country's liberation struggle. Thus, by the time the Ilongas presented the Namibian refugee to churches and other organizations in the mid-1970s, they were treading a well-worn radical humanitarian path in which languages of decolonization, humanitarianism, and human rights all coexisted, and in which Owala and other Third World theologians had helped to shape. From this standpoint, Salathiel and Anita pursued their work on behalf of Namibian refugees over 2.5 years. From the beginning, their experiences were turbulent. Although SWAPO helped the Ilongas make the necessary logistical arrangements to move from Tanzania to Zambia in January 1974, and the Christian Council of Zambia, the CCZ, offered to serve as the Ilongas' Zambian host and assist them with housing in Lusaka, negotiations with the FMS over its role were fraught. The Zambian government also presented unexpected barriers to the chaplaincy's work. A few months after the Ilongas arrived in Zambia, Salathiel held a meeting with Zambia's Minister of Interior Affairs, seeking his view of housing for Namibian refugees, especially at the Old Farm, whose corrugated iron church is depicted here. In turn, the minister reported that no buildings of permanent design were to be constructed at the farm due to the government's concern about a local farm being invaded and built by foreigners. This position was discouraging not only to Salathiel but also to SWAPO as an organization, which had been offered Swedish government aid to build at the Old Farm in 1974, but which was compelled to change plans when Zambia's foreign minister informed Swedish officials that their aid entailed non-acceptable security risks. In the interim, the Namibians at Old Farm continued to live in grass huts, old cars, and other makeshift structures. Despite these early setbacks, by the middle of 1974, the chaplaincy had turned the corner on establishing itself. Support came not only from the sponsor of Salathiel Studies, the FMS, but also from an expanding transnational network of church donors eager to support the chaplaincy's refugee work. Central to this network was Reverend Siegfried Groth, the Vereinigte Evangelische Mission, or the VAM, referred to it, in Wuppertal, Germany. By 1974, Groth had served as the VAM's representative to Namibia for 13 years and had been banned from traveling to the country due to his public critique of the apartheid South African government. In May, Groth traveled to Lusaka, where he visited the Ilongas and learned of the couple's work on behalf of the chaplaincy. Within a few weeks of this meeting, Groth had begun to collect funding from the VAM for building projects at the Old Farm, which Salathiel pursued despite the prohibition of Zambian officials. Moreover, Groth was working to expand the chaplaincy's donors through personal meetings and correspondence with other church leaders. Importantly, the Christian freedom fighter is a recurring trope in exchanges between the Ilongas, Groth, and their interlocutors. As Salathiel and Anita wrote in a letter addressed to Groth in July 31, 1974, SWAPO may have its supporters, but as these are just as much or more church as SWAPO members, the responsibility of the churches for its members in exile should not be forgotten. In reply, Grote expressed himself in similar terms, emphasizing the responsibility of the church to care for Namibian refugees, God's family in exile. Moreover, in other writing, Grote further developed this theme, emphasizing the extent to which many Namibians were both committed Christians and freedom fighters, and encouraging audiences to empathize with this merged identity. In making the latter point, Grote not only echoed the chaplaincy's language, but also used it to assert a position in contemporary European church debates about aiding liberation movements aligned with communist countries. Although the VAM, among other West German church bodies, stopped short of directly contributing to the WCC's program to combat racism, which, as I previously noted, sent aid directly to liberation movements, Grote advocated for churches to donate to the Chaplaincy, an organization run by an ordained SWAPO-affiliated minister with whom Grote had developed a trusting relationship. At the same time as Grote was spreading the news of the Chaplaincy's work among colleagues in Europe, events in southern Africa heightened the pitch of the Chaplaincy's call for support. By early June 1974, SWAPO members in exile were aware of Namibians who had crossed the border into Angola and were making their way to Zambia. Soon, the Ilongas, Grote and their interlocutors, were spreading the word widely, and new organizations became involved in supporting the chaplaincy, including humanitarian organizations with no church affiliations. By July 6, as the first few hundred Namibians crossed the Angola and Zambian border, the Zambian office of UNICEF had provided funding for housing material and other items. Before the first few hundred Namibians arrived at the old farm in late August, the chaplaincy had begun to receive aid from the VAM, Grote's German friends, and the Lutheran World Federation's Christian Refugee Service in Lusaka, which collectively remained the largest sources of aid until at least March 1975. And as the months progressed, the chaplaincy's list of donors expanded. And I won't list them all here. Significantly, during the latter half of 1974 and the first half of 1975, when the lack of food, medicine, and housing in SWAPO camps were at their most acute, the chaplaincy was accessing and distributing aid more quickly than any through its transnational donor network than SWAPO could through its official international channels. One of the recurring themes, evident not only in the chaplaincies but also in SWAPO's official records, is the challenges that SWAPO faced in accessing aid at the time of the Exodus's arrival in Zambia. The Ilongas are referred to these challenges repeatedly in their correspondence, such as this extract from a letter to Grote. "We are busy trying to get some first aid for them, blankets, clothes, food. But one thing complicates matters and threatens to disrupt the aid we until now have gotten from UNICEF. The OAU, that's the Organization of African Unity, demands that all aid to liberation movements should be channeled through its Liberation Committee in Dar es Salaam or through governments holding freedom fighters. Now the Office of the Chaplaincy to Namibians, which does not sort directly under SWAPO, may be the one channel left to receive humanitarian aid without passing the long uncertain OAU and government channels." Regardless of whether the chaplaincy was indeed the only such channel at this moment, it was without doubt the crucial one. By sending money to the Ilonga's bank account at Barclays in Lusaka, organizations responded quickly to the call to aid Namibian refugees. In turn, the Ilongas were distributing food, medicine, clothes, and books to Namibians and building shelters and camps, thereby circumventing restrictions placed on SWAPO by the Zambian government. Much of this work occurred at the old farm, where most newcomers arrived before SWAPO sent some of them on assignments and where the Ilongas served them directly. By the end of 1974, however, the chaplaincy was also distributing aid at Sinanga, a town near the Namibian border, and had established small camps in Western Province where SWAPO was accommodating Exodus exiles alongside its guerrilla soldiers, and the two newly arrived pastors, Oscar Shamwe and Josiah Wahango, worked for several months also on the chaplaincy's behalf. Even after emergency aid from Sweden, the Soviet Union, and other donors began to enter the old farm through its official international channels in late 1974 and early 1975, the chaplaincy remained better positioned to address momentary crises and specific requests from SWAPO officials, especially in camps that were remote from Lusaka. Nevertheless, it was precisely the chaplaincy's efficacy in securing and distributing aid to Namibian refugees that made it increasingly threatening to some SWAPO officials in the midst of an escalating crisis within the liberation movement. To understand this threat and how some SWAPO officials sought to control it, we turn now to the politics of aid distribution in the SWAPO camps at that time. Next one, please. And this is I'm not going to constantly speak to the different numbers on this map, but they do refer to different camps that are administered by SWAPO. The old farm is marked by the number 5 on the map, and you see 2, 3, and 4 to the left or the west of the map. These are the camps that were sort of hybrid spaces with guerrillas and new-coming exiles at the border. These are the 2 key locations and that's in Western Province. These are the 2 key locations for following the narrative that I'm going to share. It's also useful to note where Angola is there to the west, because that's also part of the story. As previously noted, from the Ilonga's arrival in Zambia in January 1974, the focus of much of their aid distribution was at the old farm outside Lusaka. With the support of donations, the Ilongas purchased a pickup truck and established a routine of driving the 26 miles from the city to the old farm, where they worked on various projects aimed at meeting the needs of the camp's inhabitants during the week and leading worship services on Sundays and other holy days. But during the 1974-1975 rainy season, as the pressures of Namibians entering the camp were at their peak, Salato reported that he and others had struggled to travel in and out of the old farm because of the effect of rains on the road. The road was critical for bringing food and other supplies to the old farm and for transporting sick people to Lusaka, tasks for which the chaplaincy had primary responsibility at that time. Over the coming months, Salatio began to raise money for machinery and materials that could be used to improve the road, presumably for use in mid-1975 during the dry season. At some point that year, however, the project broke down. By way of explanation, Salatio says that while he was working on the road, he began to hear rumors that through his work at the old farm, he was trying to undermine the SWAPO leadership. At roughly the same time, SWAPO leaders openly chastised the chaplaincy for a report written by Salatio's colleague, Oscar Shamwe, and sent to UNICEF and the UN Commissioner to Namibia. Apparently, the document, which reports on disease, malnutrition, unhygienic water, poor accommodation, and inefficient transport in SWAPO's Western Province camps, was seen by some SWAPO leaders not as a cry to help suffering Namibian refugees, but as a critique of the organization's leadership. These setbacks may in part reflect differences in the political ideologies of the chaplaincy's leaders and the SWAPO officials with whom they interacted. For example, Nasangula, the principal at the Old Farm School and later the Prime Minister of Namibia, openly criticized church people, quote unquote, for organizing activities independently of SWAPO, and is remembered for his efforts to disrupt the chaplaincy's church services in various ways. Regardless of how exactly Angula understood Christianity during the mid-1970s, his views differed from the Ilongas and their staunchest supporters, who presented their SWAPO membership primarily as a matter of living out a personal Christian faith. Such differences, moreover, are not surprising, for while the vast majority of SWAPO's Exile membership had been baptized in Namibia as Christians, they were also exposed in exile to a panoply of revolutionary ideologies, including Marxism-Leninism, generating competing views about Christianity's role in the liberation struggle. Also, some SWAPO officials may have looked askance at the chaplaincy because of how they understood Salatio's decision to marry a white woman. Although SWAPO officially endorsed the Ilonga's marriage by sending a prominent representative to the wedding and granting Anita SWAPO membership, there were individuals who privately confronted Salatio about his marital choice on the premise that it called into question Salatio's political commitment to liberating, quote, his people. Regardless of the impact of such differing political views, the chaplaincy's mere attempt to distribute humanitarian aid to Namibian refugees had significant political effects. To comprehend these effects, it is important to understand the conflict unfolding within SWAPO at this time and the threat which the Ilongas posed in that context. In 1975, the SWAPO Youth League and its allies, most notably SWAPO Secretary of Information Andreas Shipanga, were demanding that the liberation movement follow through on its prior resolution to hold a party congress by the end of 1974, 5 years since the previous time there was any kind of sort of democratic decision-making about who the leaders were and what the policies were of the party. For many Exodus exiles, above all those who had recently trained as guerrilla soldiers and were living in camps at the front in the Western Province, the Congress represented an opportunity to discuss their grievances with the liberation movement's leadership. Grievances included an increasingly severe lack of food and military supplies in SWAPO camps, especially the ones at the front, which were harder to access, as well as the delivery of weapons to UNITA, one of 3 Angolan liberation movements contending for power at that time. Nevertheless, SWAPO President Sam Nujoma and Secretary of Defense Peter Nanyamba did not respond to these concerns, which were deeply entangled in the Zambian government's ongoing détente negotiations with the apartheid South African government, and they refused to convene a party congress to discuss them. Salatio, for his part, denies that he took sides in this conflict, but volunteers that he was insensitive to the political differences between SWAPO leaders. According to him, he gave directly to different members of the National Executive Committee, the SWAPO's highest organ, upon requests. Nanyamba, the Secretary of Defense, came himself and asked for food. And on Shipanga, the Secretary of Information, again himself, he came and asked for food. I thought they were working together. And yet Nanyamba and Shipanga were on opposing sides of the party congress issue and had been a part of strange factions within SWAPO for years prior to the Exodus's arrival. By giving to Shipanga, Salatio was effectively affirming Shipanga's authority as a legitimate SWAPO leader. Moreover, he was threatening Nujoma and Nanyamba's capacity to manage exiled Namibians through the distribution of supplies in SWAPO camps, a key means of social control and the conditions of scarcity prevailing in the camps at that time. Also the main theme of my doctoral thesis and book that I published. The fact that the Ilonga's home was popular among many exiles who needed a place to sleep in Lusaka may have heightened the suspicion that the Ilongas were sympathetic to those who were pushing to hold a party congress. The threat posed by the Ilonga's refugee work appears only to have increased towards the end of 1975 as SWAPO prepared to move the Namibian refugees at Old Farm to a new piece of land set aside for them in the Kaoma district, more than 500 kilometers west of Lusaka. That's marked on the map by the number 8. Over several weeks, a group of SWAPO members cleared the densely wooded bush and built houses with the saplings. And by January, the Old Farm's inhabitants had been transferred to Nyongo, a population that may have exceeded 500. The new camp did not have sufficient food to meet the needs of these numbers, however. According to Keshi Natanyo, the SWAPO Youth League's president and one of those involved in Nyongo's construction, the food shortages merited a special trip to Lusaka, where he and Shelley Shangula, another SWAPO Youth League leader, requested food and other supplies for the people at Nyongo. When their efforts to access such food through SWAPO's office were denied, they turned to Salatio Ilonga, who indicated that there was food and clothing stored at the WCC's office, awaiting collection by SWAPO officials. Thereafter, Salatio met with Andrea Shipanga, who helped collect the food and arranged for it to be transported with a Zambian truck to Nyongo. Despite initial resistance from the man assigned by SWAPO to administer the new camp, the aid was eventually distributed. Nevertheless, Ilonga was marked for collecting aid with Shipanga and bypassing other SWAPO officials. A few weeks later, following a trip to Nyongo, Shipanga sought to collect more food for the camps, visiting several offices and embassies as he searched for supplies. Eventually, he received a large shipment of food from the West German government, but before he could send the food to Nyongo, it was confiscated. In what was probably the first public denouncement of Shipanga, SWAPO officials announced from the Nyongo parade that Andrea Shipanga had collaborated with the West German imperialists and that, with the food he had gathered, he intended to poison the Namibian people. The Ilongas, in turn, were implicated by association, rumored to be aligned with Shipanga and his allies. On April 21, 1976, the Zambian army arrested Andrea Shipanga and 5 other SWAPO officials from their Lusaka homes, the first of a series of arrests of SWAPO members in Zambia within weeks. In turn, the Ilongas came to expect their arrests, or worse, at any time. On June 3rd, they received a deportation letter informing them that the Zambian government had declared them prohibited immigrants and that they must leave the country within 7 days. A week later, they departed for Finland, where Salati was granted political asylum but expelled from SWAPO, a point solidified when in August when he received a telegram from the SWAPO Central Committee informing him of his expulsion. Although Erastus Haikali, the camp commander at Nyango, assumed responsibility for the chaplaincy, the organization changed fundamentally after the Ailonga's departure. On September 1, Sam Nyoma appointed Haikali as a liaison between SWAPO and church organizations. Thereafter, Haikali and others led worship services in SWAPO camps, expanding these activities across Namibia's growing exile population. The chaplaincy was directly under the control of the President's office, however. It was no longer permitted to distribute any material assistance to Namibian refugees. Moving now to a conclusion. In scholarship on liberation movements and international solidarity in Africa, the Ailongas appear at most as a footnote to discussion of SWAPO's 1974-76 crisis. Nevertheless, the Ailongas' work with the chaplaincy provides important context, not only for understanding the crisis among Namibians, but also for grappling with global refugee history. As I have emphasized here, central to the chaplaincy's success in assisting displaced Namibians in this period of intense need was its ability to present a compelling image to potential donors of who a Namibian refugee was and of the chaplaincy's capacity to do good work on behalf of this population. Eventually, however, the chaplaincy's definition, which was open to a range of displaced Namibians loosely characterized as Christian freedom fighters, ran aground because it encompassed exiled Namibians who were in conflict with Christian leaders in an international community increasingly aligning itself not merely with SWAPO, but with a few individuals who could speak on SWAPO's behalf. Between 1976 and 1990, when Namibia finally achieved its independence from South African rule, SWAPO received growing quantities of aid to support its refugee camps in Zambia and Angola, and mass-produced images of the Namibian refugee for solidarity audiences. These images include a version of the image with which my presentation began, an iconic photo of Namibia's freedom fighter refugees. While the photo overlaps with imagery deployed during an earlier era, the Ailongas and others who helped to construct it are excluded from the photo's history. Moreover, the Ailongas and many others were rendered dissidents who had allegedly betrayed the liberation struggle, resulting in their stigmatization and many further hardships in later years when they returned to Namibia. It follows that the chaplaincy story exposes not only a gap in our understanding of the Ailonga's role in mediating between Namibian refugees in the world, but also points to the limits in how we have understood international solidarity and how this topic has been studied. Importantly, although the Scandinavian and Eastern Bloc literature illuminates the remarkable extent to which some governments became involved in anti-colonial and anti-apartheid work in Southern Africa, it does not address how material aid became entangled in liberation movement politics, because it presents solidarity primarily through interactions between a government and a liberation movement and its officials. Moreover, the literature presumes that these and later developments occurred external to the aid that governments were providing, not as part and parcel of an emerging system for distributing aid that legitimized national hierarchies at the expense of competing voices making claims on the Namibian refugee experience, voices which remain silenced largely in Namibia to this day. The Ailonga's refugee work in mid-1970s Zambia marks a key moment in the formation of this system, opening our imagination to a range of other people and experiences that are excluded when we take the nation as our frame for thinking about international solidarity. Such stories of individuals, biographies, may also open insight into refugee history more broadly. As previously suggested, scholars have not engaged substantially with what it meant to be a refugee amidst decolonization in Africa, let alone the wider public, which rarely invokes unique histories of displaced people when evaluating contemporary refugee history issues, which are so dominated by the image of refugee as a victim or a threat, always a burden. the Ilongas articulated one such understanding of who a refugee was and who a refugee might be, drawing from a regional African discourse and Christian anti-colonial work to make the case for why churches and other organizations ought to become involved in caring for Namibian refugees affiliated with SWAPO. Through the Ilongas, the lecture suggests the importance of examining the language through which refugees have presented themselves to the world before now-dominant associations with that term have become settled. Moreover, it points to the value of listening to individuals who have spoken powerfully on refugees' behalves, but whose voices remain curiously excluded from refugee history. Thank you.
Dr. Williams can take questions now. I would ask that you try to speak up when you ask the questions so the mic can pick them up. Although if you're not comfortable yelling, I'll yell. I'll repeat the question. But if you ask a question, you have to raise your hand like that. So, who has a question? Okay, I have a question. So I'm curious, you mentioned Finland, you mentioned Sweden.
Yeah.
I mean, you did mention it was Groot,
Yeah,
right?
Groot.
Who's a private citizen of Germany.
Yeah.
But so Germany was the original colonial power, so how involved or uninvolved was Germany with the Namibian struggle for independence?
Okay. So Germany was quite involved in all manner of complex ways. I mean, to start with the church connection, I will say that Namibia is overwhelmingly Christian in terms of identity. It's usually marked the most Christian country in Africa, with more than 90% of the population identifying as Christian. Probably most exiles would have had that, were baptized in the Christian denomination at childhood. That's very important for responding to this question, because the mission societies become very important interlocutors in the liberation struggle, especially when it comes to humanitarian issues and refugee issues. So you've already heard about the Finnish Mission Society, but the VAM, this was the society that missionized in the entire southern and central part of Namibia. And so they were people who were connected to the church, were very, in Germany, were very significant mouthpieces, both for Namibian exiles in Europe, but also trying to engage the German population in donating. The German government's issues are quite complicated. There's actually a book just published this year on how the Cold War conflict played out and how Germany related to Namibia. The East Germany was absolutely claimed solidarity with Namibia from the beginning. Part of its identity was maintaining solidarity with countries in Africa that were opposing colonial regimes and giving aid directly to liberation movements, and projecting colonialism as an outgrowth of capitalism in the West, right? So West Germany was, at the time of this conflict that I described, was actually trying to become increasingly engaged with the liberation movements, moving from a more conservative stance that said that these are extensions of communism, and therefore as defenders of the West we will not engage with them, to engaging them, because the argument that the then left-center-leaning government, the SPD, was making was that if you don't engage with these liberation movements, they're going to become part of the Eastern Bloc, because the Eastern Bloc is paying attention and giving aid, and this Western approach is going to alienate. So right at this moment, the German Foreign Minister Franz Dietrich Genscher gives aid directly to refugees in 1975, and then it got caught up in this conflict, and there's an immediate sort of cooling off of German relations. And I think there's still a lot of open questions about how the German government's aid at that moment, and Andre Shiponga and the Alongas, what exactly happened there. But from that point forward, the German government in West Germany was trying to engage, much more involved than, say, the government in the U.S. or a number of other Western governments. But a lot of the impetus to solidarity with the liberation movement would have been from church bodies and civil society, as much was in Western countries that got involved in Southern Africa's liberation struggles more broadly. Yeah.
From one of the maps that you had on there, it looked to me like the Copper Belt region was not really well represented with refugee camps.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's what I know about Zambia. That's probably the next to Lusaka. It's the most populous area of Zambia.
Yes.
So I was surprised that there's nothing up around the Golden Kitway.
Yeah, I wonder, I haven't picked anything up about conversation to start a camp there. I mean, of course, there's a lot of emphasis in the Zambian government side to move outside of urban areas. The idea was, I mean, and this becomes, for UNHCR and other organizations, by the 1980s, putting refugees in camps becomes the desired way to engage with refugees. I mean, likewise, the Zambian government thought, move them to remote rural places where they're less likely to interfere potentially with if there are conflicts. These are guerrilla movements, they might interfere with hosts. In some cases, not perhaps as much in Zambia as in Tanzania, they were mobilized in rural areas as forms of labor to actually sort of develop regions. But there is, I've just written an article on Namibian refugees who spent time in the Copper Belt. These have been entirely written out of the history. As I've made clear in what I've been sharing, I've been talking about SWAPO camps. But as I also said at the beginning, there was this large refugee population which was in a UNHCR camp that SWAPO was trying to get into its camps. Well, there were also a lot of other Namibians that were also in UNHCR camps, and UNHCR didn't require its people to stay in camps. They were often permitted to move, and many of them did go to the Copper Belt. So there were Namibians who lived in the Copper Belt and made lives in the Copper Belt, but not in camps, as far as I'm aware. Yeah.
So you said that that particular couple have returned to Namibia and faced some complications. I was wondering whether those complications were from officials or if they were more personal.
Yeah. Yes, so the question was about the complications that the Ilongas experiences when they returned to Namibia, and whether they were official or more personal. They were shaped by an official context, and they were both official and personal. In 1991, so most Namibians repatriated in 89 and 1990. By that point, there were 45,000 Namibians who repatriated. Usually it's estimated that about 60,000 by the end of the 1980s had moved into exile. So you can see after the exodus, there were many, many more people that came. This is really an early moment. So in 1991, Salate Ilonga was assigned to become the pastor at the church where he where he was raised, in the mission station where he was raised. And in 1994, he was dismissed from the church and for any further belonging in the church, in a context in which the ruling party was putting great pressure on churches to align with policy and to be SWAPO members. And a conflict emerged there, which cannot be reduced to these politics. But as soon as there were disagreements with what was going on at the mission, it became very possible to start talking about what the Ilongas might have done in exile, rumors about what had happened in exile. Because these things I'm telling you about, these are mostly in the realm of rumors and stories that are not shared openly. But that's, this sort of thing happened to very many people in Namibia after independence. And they were both very political, very shaped by political policy and government, but also very personal. They were at a very micro, conflicts at a micro level. I say just a bit more about the conflict to give you just a little bit more context. The immediate crux of the conflict that unfolded was the Ilongas, when they came back to Namibia, they came back with some items from Finland. And there were questions in the community about whether those items belonged to them or they belonged to the church. And in a context in which rumors start to be spread about what belongs to whom in a rural community, it led to all kinds of accusations which eventually were all disproved, but there was a lot of chance for people who either believed these things or who believed that the Ilongas had stolen certain items, or who actually honestly or were just utilizing that story for their own personal interest to play off of the things that had happened in exile. And I find a lot of things around history and destigmatization in Namibia have worked like that. Yeah.
Well, I have one more question that I apologize to the class if you already talked about this in the earlier class, but I mean across almost all of Africa, you've got countries, former colonial holdings, getting their independence in the late 50s, early 60s, and by early 60s I mostly mean like 1960. And yet down here we have Namibia and Angola and Mozambique and Zimbabwe, and we're in the 70s, the mid-70s, and these countries are still fighting for independence. So why? What's going on that's so different from the rest of the continent?
So these had large white settler populations, okay? And there was an interest in holding on to power. So it was the racial politics or underbedding this, or undergirding this. You will probably have at least heard something about apartheid in South Africa before. Namibia was a colony, as I mentioned in passing, of apartheid. South Africa, what is now Zimbabwe, southern Rhodesia, was a British colony, part of Rhodesia that broke off a large white settler population, and Angola also had significant settler populations, but beyond that, much more in Angola than in Mozambique. But Portugal, when the world was moving one direction, was saying that we need to let go of colonies, it's a new era. Portugal was going in the other direction and saying that it's part of our national identity, and that for the world to put, for anyone to tell us that we have to let go of our colonies is actually an infringement of our rights as a sovereign state. And that is a very important context now for the refugee issues, because as I shared with the class, earlier, in the founding statute of UNHCR, which is created to promote the Geneva Convention on Refugees of 1951, is political neutrality, which means we don't interfere in the dealings of sovereign states, okay? And it was done in an era when these were all colonies. So when Portugal decided it was going to hang on, southern Rhodesia said it's going to hang on, apartheid South Africa was the most powerful in the region, holding Namibia and South Africa. There was no space for organizations that were claiming political neutrality to engage or even to give to refugees. It becomes a bit more complicated after that, but it does, just to move one step beyond the question, I think it speaks to a meta issue around refugees in Africa more broadly. Is it possible to engage effectively with refugee issues if the political causes that generate people moving from one country to another are not able to be dealt with in the system for managing refugees? And if you do need to engage politically in order to really get to the root causes of refugee issues in that context and in ours, what kind of political engagement is effective? Because as I've clearly outlined in this story, distributing humanitarian aid becomes very political, is very complicated, even in many contexts, including this one I've described. So.
Okay, so I would invite everyone to thank Dr. Williams for